Okay, everyone, thank you for being here today. So we're going to discuss modeling. This is to be a dialogue. This is to ask the department maybe how they arrived at some of these questions, and we will analyze them as we go forward. Jeff will have plenty of information to share with us on how they established some of their assumptions. So anyway, and this will not be the only meeting on modeling that we have. So you may think of questions after you leave here, or you may have a question you don't get answered. Put it down in writing, get it to us, to Bill or Jake or myself, or all, preferably all three of us, and then we will share them with the department and go from there. We have two people on the phone. We have Ashley, and then who else do I have on the phone? Yes, Chris Ward from Pulte. Okay. Oh, good morning, Mike. Thank you. Anybody else? So I think we have three. We may have to.
Jeremy Kerlock representing UDA here as well.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. If you're on the phone, we may have to repeat your question because we're trying to get the questions recorded. We'll pass this mic around. There's not a PA system, but all these mics are hooked to the video. And then it'll take us a couple of days to post the video, but you'll be able to watch this on the website. I believe we had somebody else just join on the phone.
This is Carlos Ronstadt, Phoenix.
Good morning, Carlos. Thank you. Anybody else? Did I cover everything, Bill, you think?
Maybe one area,
Yeah, absolutely.
Here. So what we have here today, the department is here to basically help provide some answers or just some insight on some of the modeling assumptions, the programmatic assumptions in the Pinal model. So we took the first attempt at a list of questions that we posed to the department. Didn't give them a lot of time to respond, but probably a few days, I suppose, that Jeff and his staff had it last week to review. Those were sort of the initial view of the questions. We know there are more questions that need to be answered. Time permitting, we'd like to get through sort of the questions we've already asked and go through those, the answers from the department as far as the assumptions. There may be some other, clarifying questions on some of those same issues. I think we can probably go through those today as we're going through those. But to the extent that there are other questions, if you've written them down, or if you want to email them to us, please do so. We anticipate having probably at least 2 or maybe 3 more meetings as we, start to sort of all come to a consensus or common understanding of the assumptions that were made in the model itself. So I appreciate everybody's attendance this morning. Sorry, Supervisor.
Okay, for the purpose of the people on the phone, we may have to speak up or repeat the questions to the telephone mechanism here. So, sounds like we had somebody else just join. Okay. Jeff, you ready?
As ready as I'll ever be. Is it on? Okay. So I have everything I need, I think, here. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Inwood. I'm the Chief Hydrologist at the Department of Water Resources. Have a few of my other DWR employees, including some modeling people, Keith Nelson, Diane Yunker. With me today are Deputy Director Clint Chandler and our, Nicole, what's your official title now? Deputy Chief Counsel with us. And there are some questions that really fall outside of the scope of the modeling, so Nicole will probably speak up on those. If there are additional questions, some of our staff may speak up as well. So, do you have that? So,
I think you're probably going to have to just do it like
Yeah, manually, okay, so I can go to there, okay. Great. So like Bill said, we got a list of questions early last week. We have prepared written responses to them. We brought copies. Everybody should have a copy if they want. I'll try to go through them one by one. I'll read them out loud and then go through the answers. I guess, should I put those up there so everybody can see them? That might be a good way to start. Let me do that.
This is Carlos Ronstadt. Are you gonna post some of this on the DWR's Pinal website, the website you have?
Yes, we will. We have not done it yet, but we will do that once we get back to the office.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so diving in, question one, how is reclaimed water from wastewater providers that are not also water providers or designated providers with an assured water supply handled in the model? And the answer up here, which is it's the same for any wastewater provider, whether they're designated or not, is that their credits are removed. The long-term storage credits that are gained are removed from the model. The existing credits, which total a little over 14,000 acre-feet as of the end of 2015, were removed at 1/100th per year over 100 years. Then for the future, the projection period, the simulation period, we did not include effluent recharge at USFs because those would also have to be removed. And anyone else, the credits can only be relied upon by those who accrue the credits. So they really can't be relied on by everybody to prop up the aquifer. There have been questions in the past about why we don't just assume that all the demands that are in the model produce some percentage of effluent and that we include that in the model. And our response there in writing that if we're provided with plans, we would look at them and evaluate them and see if we needed additional information or assurances to confirm that whatever plans were going to be put into place to be relied upon for creating effluent would actually be usable in the model.
Jeff, if I may, hopefully we can ask just like clarifying questions as we're going through the presentation here today. But concerning the discussion where, evaluating plans to determine, what would be required to update the assumptions and so forth, has the department accommodated a wastewater provider's, say recharge in other areas that we could look to as an example? So where you have a wastewater provider and they're storing the water, have they contracted for the effluent production for a development, let's say going forward, or have they contracted for the credits to be used by a development in the future? That may be more a question for the assured water supply folks. So I guess maybe we'll have some spin-off questions for them as well. But as we look at solutions, I think having an idea of, okay, we understand why it's not in the model, right, why it's taken out of the model, but we probably want to understand how would we be able to bring it into the model at some point.
Right, and my short answer is I don't have any examples to give you from other examples that you were looking for. I don't know if, Nicole, if you have anything else, otherwise we'd have to go back and look into that.
We certainly
Hold
have
on, hold on.
We certainly have examples that involve applications for determinations, whether it's certificates or designations that would include effluent, either reuse, non-potable reuse, or recharge and recovery for potable use. I can't think of any off the top of my head that involve including it in the model when it's not necessarily associated with a particular determination. I think given the situation where you have a separate wastewater provider managing effluent reuse, that we might be able to consider that. But again, we'd need to start by getting some specific plans about how that would be put to use.
Any other questions on that? Yes, Doug?
So just as a follow-up to that, specifically, I had an applicant within one of our service areas in Phoenix that was having issues with showing physical availability of groundwater. We offered to move that certificate forward using recharge and recovery of reclaim, existing facilities on as far as recovery wells, recharge facility, everything's permitted, an actual flowing set of reclaim water out of our plants. This wasn't projected from the subdivision itself, and I still had problems, was essentially denied that process, that approach by the department, because we were told that we would still have to demonstrate the physical availability of groundwater in addition to showing that that's, we were recovering within the area of a hydrologic impact. Wells were within a mile of our recharge site. So I'm just wondering if the department is still hung up on that, or if they're willing to examine physical availability separately from the other constraints within assured water supply, specifically consistency with goal, et cetera.
And again, short answer is that that's not in the modeling area, so I don't have an answer for you on that. I don't, if you want.
I was going to say, let's not get bogged down on specific projects. Let's try and get through the modeling portions of this discussion.
Yeah, I don't think the department's position has changed on commingling. What I was referring to was more of a generalized modeling projection, taking into account general effluent reuse and recharge and recovery patterns that might be applicable to either reduce the demands or to support supplies generally, and not on a project-by-project basis. Although, we can incorporate that on a project-by-project basis where it's appropriate.
Concerning commingling, I'm not going to get into the whole commingling topic, but when you say commingling, are you talking about commingling of recharged effluent that's commingled with groundwater, so that when it's recovered, it's commingled with groundwater? Is that the commingling you're talking about?
That would be a whole new expansion.
Yeah, it's not just that it's by virtue of being recharged and recovered, it's commingled. It's the commingling issue has to do with the fact that when you're putting a non-groundwater supply into a system that includes a groundwater supply, and then you're trying to account for it through the assured water supply program, as though the non-groundwater supply is exclusively directed to one subdivision.
If the long-term storage credits cannot be simulated in the model, so is it possible for the owner of these credits to provide like a plan of using this credit, so we can offset the demand? If we cannot simulate from the recharge site, can we simulate from the demand? Because when they pump this water out, or they got to be used this water somehow. So is it possible this way?
In some cases, that may be possible and appropriate. That's going to be very case specific, but we can certainly take a look at that.
Topic at 10. Modeling.
Well, and then, so question 2, we'll get right into the agricultural demands. Still up there. Concerning ag demands, what assumptions were made for these demands within each irrigation district and outside irrigation districts? What method did ADWR use to come up with the demands over the 100-year period? What is it based on? So in your answer there, their first response, we talk about non-district IGFR lands. And essentially, there's a set number of IGFR acres. They're outside of districts. What we did for those, any assured water supply overlays on those IGFRs, we removed any wells on those overlays, any ag wells within the assured water supply overlays of those IGFRs were removed, so that pumping was discontinued. The remaining ag lands that were not overlain by assured water supply determinations, those wells were assumed to continue pumping, serving the demands of the remaining ag lands. And that pumping, which in the model, if I remember correctly, represents about 29,000 acre feet per year, was held constant over the 100-year projection period. So that one's pretty straightforward. Let me move down. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Mark.
When you say assured water supply, are you talking about both certificates and analysis?
Yes, I'm sorry, that's a good point. Yes, I'm talking about analyses and certificates only, not designations, because designations cover a whole service area. So moving on to the district agricultural demands and how they were determined. Those are essentially done through our AMA section staff, and the beginning point is to determine an overall annual water demand for the district lands, the IGFRs inside those lands, and it was a fairly simple approach. You have to determine the amount of acres that you believe will be in production and use a historical average water use per acre, multiply those together, and you come up with a total demand per year that is projected out for 100 years. Now, within that total demand, the general approach is to use non-groundwater supplies first, typically CAP ag pool water where available and to certain districts, GSF water. We actually included CAGRD replenishment, like an in lieu supply. So we, through a process the AMA staff does to determine how much population M&I needs there'll be for these non-groundwater supplies, figure that out, and then kind of come down to what's left is a residual that would be made up by groundwater. So in a nutshell, that's the process. Let's start there because I'll get into some more specific by district numbers if anybody has any questions about that, the broad-based approach.
Jeff, just one basic question about the average use.
Mhm.
Is there a time period that you used to establish that average?
It was generally 2014 was a year that we based it on, and I will run through the numbers, the average uses, and I'll talk about Central Arizona and Maricopa Stanfield because they provided some numbers too. So in those two district cases, we have DWR average use numbers and the districts provided numbers. So for Central Arizona Irrigation District, they use 4.2 acre feet per acre from the period of 2016 through 2029, and then they dropped it down to 4.0 acre feet per acre from 2030 through 2115. ADWR calculated the average use at 4 acre feet per acre, so we use 4. For Maricopa Stanfield, they had 4.4 acre feet per acre from 2016 through 2029, and that dropped down to 4 acre-feet per acre, 2030 to 2115. The department calculated 3.66 acre-feet per acre. For Hohokam, the department came up with 3.77 acre-feet per acre. That was an average based on 2015 reported use, as well as analysis of cropland data layer and USGS information, and that averaging those came out to 3.77. And from San Carlos? Yeah.
Your 3.77 on HOCAM, did that also include in 2014 the CAP deliveries?
That was total water use.
Which of course, now you're holding that constant for 100 years, whereas in 10 years the CAP deliveries go away entirely. How does that work into a model?
Well, so as we have demonstrated, or as we've shown in the past, when the CAP pool water goes away, that has to be made up by groundwater, essentially.
Has there been a single new irrigation well drilled in the HOCAM irrigation district by an individual, because there is no commonality of ownership in HOCAM? Has there been a single new irrigation well drilled since the enaction of the 1980 Groundwater Act?
I'm not aware.
I think the answer to that is no, or maybe one, but no. So how do we assume that in the last 40 years, all there's been is a reduction of pumping capacity, regardless of what the circumstances are, and with the deletion of the CAP supply, all of a sudden, new wells start being drilled, even though the agricultural economy provably cannot afford to do that whatsoever? How do you model CAP water in that doesn't exist anymore for the next 100 years?
So all I'm going to say is that I was part of the DCP negotiations and discussions, and the agricultural community was vehemently arguing for making up the lost CAP water with as much as they can, with understanding that there are limitations because groundwater may not be able to be delivered everywhere throughout the district, but that water was going to be made up. And as I understand it, there's many millions of dollars that have been appropriated for the drilling of additional wells as part of the DCP program.
And indeed, for a large irrigation district that has many wells that it owns, if it can get a subsidization to create some new wells, those indeed can be drilled. But when that subsidization runs out, there won't be any more. But every few years that goes by, 60 and 70-year-old wells cease to function. You haven't modeled that in any fashion whatsoever. In HOCAM and non-district and San Carlos, you assume pumping to stay the same for 100 years. Why don't you use the model, given facts, of how much pumping has decreased since 1980 to 2020 because of the reduction of the available well fields? Those well fields were created at a time when the agricultural economies and the costs of wells intersected, and it was possible to create those well fields. That's not possible anymore.
Scott, so here's what I'm going to say. Here's what I'm going to say.
Okay, that's fine.
The ag community is not going to go away. They will find a way to deal with this. In 2016 and 2017, the average annual pumping was close to 450,000 acre-feet per year. Our model starts in 2016 with about 400,000 acre-feet of pumping and goes up to as high as 590,000 acre-feet. That is not unrealistic to assume that there will be new wells, replaced wells, and things done to replace the loss of the CAP water. I don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what's going to happen, but that was our best assumption. We are not going to just assume, because we cannot, that ag pumping and ag farming is going to go away.
Well, no, actually, the problem is, different point, different point, because this one's important. The problem here in this is your assumptions come out in directions that are actually provably false. I'm sitting right here looking at your assumption for the San Carlos Irrigation and Drainage District. And you hold for 100 years 86,000 acre-feet of pumping in the San Carlos Irrigation and Drainage District for 100 years. Now, the truth of the
That's not 86,000 groundwater, that's 80,000 total.
Well, if it's renewable surface water, then that's an addition to the AMA, not a subtraction. It's an addition, because it's renewable surface water that comes in every year and adds to the aquifer through incidental recharge. But the fact of the issue is, San Carlos pumping for the last 9 years, and they have pumped everything they can, because they're short. So they use their wells as heavily as they possibly can. And for the last 9 years, they've pumped 20,000 acre-feet a year. Plus, they've had a surface water supply on top of that that puts in incidental recharge. Those are facts. Those aren't models. They're facts. And you,
Scott, let me just stop you right there. Tell us what the numbers are. We've asked you a month ago for numbers, and we haven't gotten anything from you.
I just gave you numbers for pumping for San Carlos.
So I'm talking about the projection period.
We're talking, talk
I'm
about
done.
how they've gotten to their assumptions and going forward, you can put that.
That's how we did it.
Okay, that's perfect then. We'll put it all down together then.
Supervisor, if I may, really, purpose of today's meeting is to understand these assumptions. As a group, we may want to look at those assumptions, and we may want to come back with a different approach or different methodology for the department to consider in changing those assumptions when they run the model. I think those are all things that, as a group, I think we're looking to have that dialogue among ourselves to decide what it is that we want to bring back to the department in the model, okay?
And we have indicated that we are willing to consider information supplied to us.
I mean, our point here is not, we're here asking the department to provide information, what the assumptions were, how they come up with those assumptions. So if we're going to disagree with those assumptions, that's fine. And as a group, I think we have that dialogue, we have that right to consider any changes to the programmatic assumptions that we think are justified or backed up by evidence and facts, and maybe different irrigation districts, maybe they have a different perspective on how they're going to manage their operations over the next 100 years. These are all things that as a group, I think we need to have that dialogue, but we've asked the department to come here today and describe the assumptions and how they arrived at those assumptions, but not to debate necessarily in this forum anyway today, why they didn't make some other assumptions. So I'm just putting that out there because, you know, this is only the first of several meetings, so I know we're going to have the opportunity to ask more questions in the future, so just to make that point.
Thank you, Bill.
Moving on, so since I didn't get a chance to give the average water use per acre for San Carlos, that was 2.16 acre feet per acre. Moving on, so question.
Urbanization's point that you're moving on to next. So I was curious if you could help explain, first of all, how the model works with respect to where the pumping occurs for the districts. Is it well specific? And how does that change
over the model, the 100-year run, and also what happens with the demand within the districts in particular, or for that matter, for the IGFR lands that are outside of the districts, as I know that some of the unmet demand is ag demand, and some of that's related to either bedrock or ag wells going dry. So I guess what happens to the demand of the ag lands? That's if a well goes dry, do they make up the pumping somewhere else in the model, or is that just I don't know what the connection of that is, because the districts they commingle water, they move water all around the districts. And then I was also curious about the unmet ag demand number. How does that impact does that have any impact on the other sort of categories of water users and their unmet demand going forward?
Well, those are three big questions. Let me tackle them one at a time. The first question was basically, where are we modeling the pumping, right? Yeah. And the answer is we model it in the existing wells. We don't put in any new additional agricultural wells. For agricultural lands that have assured water supply certificates and analyses overlays, we discontinue the ag pumping for those wells and move it to the ag wells, the existing ag wells that are remaining on ag lands that are going to stay in production based on not having an assured water supply overlay. So that's how we account for all the pumping in the districts and on the IGFRs.
Just following up on that, do you account for the pumping from the wells that they currently pump from, or just whatever wells, I guess, are registered?
It's existing wells that are already pumping, and we just add additional pumping to those wells to make up for where needed, the wells that are lost from the assured water supply overlays. I don't think we need to get into more detail. What are you going to say, Diane?
Using the pumping rates at active wells in 2015, the remaining wells that were not urbanized by assured water supply were used as the permanent locations for all the demands, and they were assigned for 100 years at whatever rates, prorated by their 2015 rate. And all that information is available in the geodatabase that accompanied the technical memo. You can see by well.
And I forgot the second question. The third question about unmet demands, if there's unmet demand in an ag well, we are not making up for that pumping. It's lost pumping. So that, in essence, you wouldn't be able to pump that well and get all the water out that the demands are indicating are needed.
Yeah, so I guess the second question relates to that a little bit, and it's just a matter of when we start having unmet ag demand. If there are some district wells, this is more of an irrigation district question, I guess, that start going dry at some point in time, do you first try to make up some of that pumping from the remaining wells that still can access water, or does the demand, some portion of the irrigation district demand start to go away, kind of right off the bat?
Yeah, we're not making up the demand. It's unmet demand. Those wells cannot produce what's being asked of them. We're not modeling as we're operating a district like you got to find the water from somewhere else. That's not the purpose of our model. So all we're doing is showing where that unmet demand is. In reality, obviously that would be made up somewhere, somehow, but we're not chasing that water to meet those full demands.
And so I'm sorry to I'll move on here shortly, but just to make sure I understand properly then, so if ag wells start becoming unable to pump the water at some point in the model, then whatever associated portion of ag demand goes with that well just stops. But then you model it as unmet. Is that right?
That's right.
But just a clarification so I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize, I didn't fully understand it.
Wait for the microphone.
In a stranded agricultural well, that the water falls out from underneath it and it cannot pump anymore. You've indicated that that supply then goes away.
Right, that's what unmet
Does
demand
the
is.
agricultural demand go away?
No, you're not meeting that demand. That's the whole point.
But there no longer will be a demand in an agricultural field that has no water.
Correct.
But the demand isn't going away.
Well, technically no, but we're not here to solve the water.
And I don't need, I made my point.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I think I might have misunderstood or misheard this, so I just want to make sure. For the lands that are under a determination of assured water supply, if there's an ag well there, that well is turned off?
Yes, from day one of the projection period.
Okay, so how are the demands then associated with those determinations met going forward?
So then we have the assured water supply demand. We put wells on those parcels and simulate the pumping to meet the full assured water supply demands associated with those determinations. Okay. Quick discussion about urbanization. So for Maricopa, Stanfield, and Central Arizona districts, we did incorporate an urbanization. The department did that. The AMA staff did an urbanization analysis, and so that caused a reduction of acres over the 100-year projection period. We did not do that for Hohokam and San Carlos, which is another question coming up that we'll talk about that further. So in essence, what that means is the remaining agricultural lands that are not part of the assured water supply overlays, over time, the amount of acres are reduced using the average water use per acre rates that I ran through earlier. That will decrease the total demand within the district over time. Those remaining active irrigation wells, that reduced demand then is applied pro rata, like Diane said, across those remaining agricultural wells. I could draw a picture of that. I don't know if anybody has any specific questions. I wasn't going to go into the exact numbers of acres and the demands, but in essence, that's how there's a decrease of irrigation demand overall, and then correspondingly the groundwater demand as well. And it's, again, reflected in those active agricultural wells. Yes, Bill?
Waiting for the microphone. So the two elements I think that relate to what you just described, Jeff, that I have a question on is urbanization. I presume you use some kind of like a population projection to come up with the urbanization rate. Is that?
Yes, it was, again, done by our AMA staff, but as I understand it, was a traffic analysis zone population.
So the
analysis.
TAS,
Yes, the TAS
population projections.
Yes.
Is that, does TAS put out just a singular number or a range of numbers, or?
I'm not 100% sure, but my understanding is they put out, this was a 2010 census, that they had a 2040 projection, and we interpolated between 2015 and 2040, and then we also extended that out through 2115.
Okay, so that urbanization is a population-driven urbanization, and I'm sorry, these are just, you know, the pieces of that. So are you assuming a certain amount of acreage per, I mean, so for example, if the population shows, 3 more people are moving in, are you assuming that's one home on a quarter-acre lot, or is there anything like that that goes into the connection from people to basically land going out of production?
Yeah, it's a population to homes and then lands going out. The details of that I'm not familiar with. That's not a modeling function, so we didn't do that in the modeling section. But it is that type of analysis where, based on, you get the population projections and you have to determine how many homes and what land, how many acres of land that home takes, and then you, at some point, you have to determine what the cutoff is for something becoming urbanized.
And then the second half of what I was asking here was, when you talk about urbanization, you're reducing the ag demand, and you're basically spreading that within the district, right? You're reducing whatever the total amount of demand would be reduced by the population. I assume you're taking that acre feet per acre number, coming up with a new acre feet per acre number.
For the ag? Yes.
And that you're not correspondingly coming back into the model with additional demands from urban? I mean, am I assuming you're reducing the ag demand, but you're not really factoring in a new subdivision coming in for that demand? I mean, is that?
That is correct.
Okay.
So that is
I'm not sure we're asking you to do that.
Well, and I was just going to say that per our rules, we have to look at it from an assured water supply basis. And that's a good question that might require more discussion about how we account for the urbanization of those lands that are going out of agricultural production.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
There's a question in the back.
I'm curious, when the ag has pumped out and is no longer able to produce water, how does urbanization occur on that same property?
Well, within those districts that we urbanize, I'm not sure exactly what wells, I don't have in front of me which wells are going dry versus where the urbanization occurs. We did it on a district-wide basis. We are not looking at, well, this is the part that urbanized, and is there a well there, and did that one go dry? We are just assuming that there is water there for the urbanization. That may be an assumption.
Might be problematic. Yeah.
That is a good point.
So one question, Jeff, you'd mentioned on the response here, you said as the amount of agricultural lands and corresponding total water demand decreased through the projection period, pumping was reduced evenly across the remaining wells. So there was no credit, and I'm not suggesting you should go one way or the other, it's more of an explanation. I'll say it in the form of a statement. It seems that the model basically says if it goes from an ag use to an urbanization use, it does not allow for additional supply to be credited towards whatever existing agricultural land is left in the district. Is that correct?
I'm not understanding.
Okay, so, well, I'll keep it really dumb then. When you go from agricultural use down to urbanization, it's about a 75% reduction in water use, or 65% production in water use. Is that correct? It's a really simple answer. It's kind of yes or no.
We did not do an urbanization reduction calculation. We just reduced the agricultural demands. We did not trade the ag demands for municipal demands.
Okay, so what I'm getting at is there's a finite amount of water out there, right? So when the model takes into account urbanization, does it look at the remaining ag lands that are, let's say there's a farm across the street from the boundary of an analysis of assured water supply? Does the model basically say, hey, ag, you can keep pumping across the street as long as you want because there's great news. There was a 70% reduction in water use going on across the street. So we've got a ton of water left for you. Or does the model still assume, hey, that's not there for you to continue to use in ag production? That's what
It's done on a district-wide basis. We are not getting down to parcel level. If here's an irrigation district boundary, this is assured water supply, all those wells are removed. These are the remaining lands, these wells are active. Let's just say at the beginning of the projection period, it was 60,000 acres, 2 acre-feet per acre demand, that's 120,000 acre-feet for that first year. 5 years later, there's 50,000 acres. 2 acre-feet per acre equals 100,000 acre-feet. So the first year, all these wells will evenly account for 120,000. The 5 years later, all these wells will be reduced to only pump 100,000 acres. That's how we did it. So it doesn't matter what's going on across the street from there or where the urbanization is occurring. We're doing it on a well basis across the remaining active irrigated lands. Does that hopefully answer your question?
I like the picture up here now, Jeff, on it's more soothing, more calming.
Yes. Let me, and you had moved down, Augustine, to question 3, right? Yeah. I think there's a, where's?
Can I
yeah.
Before we move on again, kind of going back to the last, it's the relation between this topic and the last one we just discussed. So we know that some ag land will go out of production, not because of urbanization, but just because the districts can't produce enough water to serve all of it. And it sounds to me like maybe the model treats some of that ag land as unmet demand, but that's probably what some of that just will happen, and that land wouldn't have been farmed anyways. So for purposes of the model, when land goes out of when demand becomes unmet because the districts can't serve that water, do you think that captures in the model already that effect of this land, these districts just won't serve, they won't pump any more water for that, and there's no more real work to do there to estimate how much land will just be, also not just because of urbanization, but because of lack of sufficient water, we'll just reduce our acreage?
Well, that could be one driver that forces ag lands to go out of production is lack of water, but we did not attempt to try to estimate or pick lands that were just going to be going out of production because the owners want to sell or don't want to farm or because they run out of water. We just modeled, we tried to meet all the demands that were in the model, but the aquifer can't. So we just assume those are the unmet demands. What will happen to those lands, whether they're urbanized or just going out of production, we did not look at that.
So in the model, ag land only goes out of production if it's urbanized or if physically the well that serves it can't pump water anymore. Is that?
With an assured water supply overlay.
Okay.
Again, because our model is an assured water supply 100-year projection model. Again, we are not trying to simulate operations of farming units and account for what you're projecting you'll do or what lands might go out of production. We're doing it on a gross basis for the assured water supply.
Just a quick question. You mentioned the TAS-based population projection as the basis for the urbanization. Are the details behind that analysis documented that we could review and look into?
I'll have to check with our assured water or our active management area personnel, but I'm sure it was done because we had to have the numbers come from somewhere.
Okay, and just one other, really just a comment. That urbanization, you mentioned that for all the lands that have assured water supply determinations, that the ag uses were turned off for those lands, but that didn't necessarily apply to the designations of assured water supply. And so part of this urbanization, I think, helps account for those areas that are urbanizing within the designated water provider areas.
Yeah, and you're right, we did not specifically urbanize lands within designated providers. We don't know where the urbanization is going to occur specifically. For the designated providers in the model, except for the city of Eloy, we take their full designated volume and just assume that that will be pumped, or whatever the groundwater component of that is, will be pumped from day one for the full 100 years.
Just a quick follow-up.
Hold on.
It's not a
Next time we need 2 or 3 mics, I think.
It's not a four-part question. So within a designated provider's area, okay, there's probably some ag land within that designated provider's area. So are we modeling the designated provider's water demands and the lands, the ag lands that are pumping water also within that same geographic area?
Well, again, if they're district lands, we've already accounted for that. If there are IGFRs with outside of districts, we've accounted for that. So those would continue to be irrigated.
Okay, so with the exception of analyses and certificates that overlay ag land, probably certificates would be extinguished or retired land, but where they overlay ag land, that's truly, you've taken the ag pumping out and put the assured water supply pumping in. But all the other ag demands, wherever they may exist, they just continue based on your estimates of the, remaining pumping, absent, whatever the reduction is to urbanization. But if it happens to occur within a designated provider's area, it's just ag land within that area, and it gets the same treatment.
It would be
inside
held.
and outside.
It would be held constant. Yeah, whatever that.
Okay, thank you, Joe.
Question 3. All the way to 3. We've already talked about this. It's about urbanization. How is it handled in the model? Uniformly spreading urbanization over other ag lands, other methods. I think I've explained that. If anybody wants me to say it again or have any questions, okay. Question 4. I guess everybody has it in front of it. I won't put it up on the screen. To what extent are physical supplies limited by the depth of wells, depth of bedrock, or depth of saturated thickness as opposed to water exceeding depth of 1,000 or 1,100 feet below land surface? What portion of the 8.1 million acre feet is related to these factors? As you'll see written there, a large majority, approximately 75% of the unmet demand is water levels going below the depth of existing wells. Very small amount, 5%, is related to the whole aquifer becoming dewatered, and about the remaining 20% or so is related to what we'll call aquifer conditions. Basically, the capacity of the well to meet the demands due to aquifer conditions, transmissivity, saturated thickness. Basically, the well cannot produce the amount that's being requested. So there may be a little bit of saturated thickness, but there is not enough water to meet the demand. So what that indicates is the largest majority is related to existing well depths being exceeded, both in the agricultural sector and the assured water supply, the existing municipal and industrial wells. I want to point out that in our model, for any future proposed assured water supply wells that are placed on the assured water supply development footprint, we assume full saturated thickness and full screened interval of the aquifer. So we are not setting an arbitrary depth limit of 500 feet or 200 feet or even 1,100 feet. We're essentially letting we're assuming those wells would be drilled as deep as necessary to pull that water.
Hi, Jeff. This may be a question for a future meeting, but of that 75%, I'm curious what the breakout would be amongst the categories that you showed before, ag and future assured water supply and existing muni.
Yes, and I don't have that today. You will, in our report, one of the figures shows the where the unmet demands occur. Again, I don't have it specified which wells are related to what factors, but we can determine that and to get that information.
Table 5 on page 31 of the tech memo report has some of the categories.
So Jeff, a follow-up question on this. So I'll do the setup here. So the model in 2017 had about just under 94 million acre-feet of demands over the 100-year period, with I believe an 8.5 million acre-feet total unmet demand. And then the 2019 model run had just over 80 million acre-feet of demands over the 100-year period, with a resulting 8.1 million acre-feet of unmet demand. So a reduction about 400,000 acre-feet of unmet demand, even though there was an overall reduction of total demands by 13 or 14 million acre-feet. So this is the lead-in question here. As we struggle with what the solutions are going to be to satisfy or mitigate the unmet demand, it would help us to know, and I think why this question was asked, if the charge is to satisfy or mitigate these unmet demands in some way, and knowing that if you pull 14 million acre-feet out, you get a slight reduction in unmet demand. Equally probably probable is that if somebody brought in 80,000 acre-feet per year of new supplies to the AMA, that equals 8 million acre-feet over 100 years. Unless we target those supplies in an area that basically targets those unmet demands, I would argue that probably wouldn't necessarily resolve all the unmet demands, even if we could bring in 80,000 acre-feet of new supplies. So that's why I think it's important to know the details of the nature of the unmet demand. So if it's, well, for example, if the unmet demand is, let's say, relating to the first, the 75% of the unmet demand that's basically due to the water level being down below the bottom of the well, okay? Some would say, well, let's just drill a new well and drill the well deeper. As long as it doesn't go down below the 1,100 feet, you're not going to pump it down below that. Let's just drill a new well at some point in time. Maybe that's effective, maybe it's not, but that's certainly the question people would ask. Well, can we just replace it with a deeper well? That's number one. So if that's part of the solution, is to have maybe a satisfaction of that unmet demand by drilling new wells, that would help that. That's one approach to that, right? If it's because you're down to bedrock, right? Because the well's drilled down to bedrock and there's no more water below that, well, then that's not going to be resolved by deepening the well. But so physically, if you're bringing in a new supply, which the gist I'm getting is we need more supplies. I think everybody sort of gets that here. To the extent we can find more supplies, let's bring them in. But it's how you bring them in and where you bring them in that either will resolve the unmet demand, or it will simply bring in a supply and you still have a large amount of unmet demand because you haven't put the water where you need to, or you haven't developed an effective strategy to mitigate the unmet demand. I mean, the whole reason we're here talking is because the unmet demand is a limiting factor for projects having a going forward approval to develop their projects, right? So how we get to the solution, I think, is critical. That's why this question, I think, is so important for the group to understand. So depth of well, depth to bedrock, that's another level of problem, where the well simply can't provide the capacity. So, for example, if the model shows the water levels coming down over time, is there a point in time that maybe there's still saturated thickness left, but because of the capability of that well producing the water, say the well, in today's terms, the water level is 400 feet down, and you're producing 2,000 gallons per minute, okay? And the well is, 800 feet deep, and so you've got 400 more feet of saturated thickness, but as you get down to a point, there's still water left in the well, but you no longer can produce what you need. That becomes part of an unmet demand, correct? Because according to your, obviously objective criteria, that well simply cannot produce the water capacity that it would need to satisfy the demand. So that's another level of, can it be resolved by deepening? It's not down below the bottom of the well, but it's simply not, there's not enough productive capacity of the well to meet the demand. So those three areas, right?
Yeah, so we need to drill further down on these statistics and see a couple of things to respond. First, the comparison you did from the 2017 run with 94 million acre feet of demand versus the 2019 run with 80 million acre feet. Most of that demand reduction was due to the urbanization in the agricultural arena. So what that kind of indicates is even large reductions in agricultural demand still don't help a lot in the overall reduction of unmet demand across all the sectors. Secondly, if you, and I know there's a lot of unmet demand wells out in the two sub-basin centers where there's deep aquifer. So if you deepen those wells and you start pumping more, all that will do is make the problem worse because you'll be drawing down water even further regionally. And, but yes, we need to see where the wells, what the depths are versus the water levels, and where, especially in the Casa Grande Ridge area, where the well depths are versus where, what our aquifer thickness is. So we need to look at that further.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have a better understanding now, I think, and probably the second half of this question is going to be what portion of the unmet demand is because of the depth below 1,100 feet, right?
So, a follow-up, maybe a slight tangent, but I think it's fundamental here. This group is tasked with trying to come up with solutions to what is an impending crisis. A question that I asked you on the sidelines last week, I'd like to ask sort of more publicly, is, we're discussing assumptions that go into the model used to make determinations. Is it possible for DWR to run that model with several different sets of assumptions to test potential solutions? If we're just going for like the perfect model, or at least the best model that you will use for determinations, that's one question. But if the sort of underlying question is how do we resolve the fundamental problem, then being able to test potential solutions before people invest a lot of money in those solutions, if that's something that can be tested through the model, it seems like that would be a tremendous benefit for this whole conversation.
So here's how I'm going to respond. We are tasked, this is for assured water supply purposes only. So that's the only reason we're running this model, and that we do modeling for other purposes at the department, but there's a singular purpose. Because it's an assured water supply model, it has to be deterministic. We can only have one outcome because you have to meet a certain criteria, and if you don't get issued. If you do, you get issued. So I'm not saying we couldn't do what you're asking, but we are not tasked to do that right now. And then I'm going to, there you are. There's a study going on called the Eloy Maricopa Stanfield Basin study that is doing just that, I think.
Yeah, so we have a basin study. It lines up a little bit differently. The Assured Water Supply Program and the model associated with it is about a 100-year period and consumer protection. So they're fundamentally looking at it differently, but we're doing a 43-year model run with the basin study. It goes through 2060, and so that period was 43 years. We can test assumptions. We have six different planning scenarios we're working on now. Ultimately, we'll be modeling, I believe, 5 current plus 3 with the idea of changes, so the idea of testing assumptions. It's going to fundamentally look different and act different because of that that time period and the different things that we're going to put in the planning model, but it is something we're working on. It's also going to be a little bit different time frame where we have this, I'd say, more of an acute assured water supply program issue today. The basin study planning process is a 3-year process, and we're about 1 year into it. So we do have kind of a venue for that we're working on. A few people have also kicked around the idea of more of a planning model approach with the assured water supply model to try to test it outside of DWR's, I'd say, review of applications, maybe using their model and working on it. So there's some dialogue there. And then we still hope that maybe we can get one kind of assured water supply planning run if we have enough of our ducks in a row to ask for that kind of thing.
So a couple follow-ups. First, that model and our model are not interchangeable. We cannot, our assumptions don't necessarily work in theirs, and theirs don't work in ours. So they're really not interchangeable. Secondly, the base model, the historic model, the calibrated model that this study, the planning study is using, is our calibrated model. So they're taking our base model through 2015 and then doing their planning assumptions on top of it. So there is some link that way, but yeah, I'm gonna, any forum that I'm at, I'm gonna really harp that our purpose is for assured water supply. Our assumptions have to follow certain criteria and rules and other things that the department has to be comfortable with. So it is completely different, and the basin study planning effort, they are looking at things differently, and that's fine, but they are not interchangeable. But there is some connection in that the base model is the same.
Yeah, the base model and the idea that we could test some assumptions like well depths different, growth different patterns, but we'd ultimately then be making maybe a policy proposal to ADWR, like if we reuse effluent all this way and these 64 wells were deep into this depth, you know, can we paper that up in a legal kind of way that can work for assured water supply, I think, is our hope, at least, with the basin study model, that it helps inform decision-making on our side before costly things are done, and then can also continue a dialogue with DWR. Yes, Augie. Hang on just one second. Sorry, slow walker sometimes.
Thanks. I'm just kind of looking at the response in an effort to try to find solutions. One baseline assumption I want to make sure I'm correct on. If the large majority, 75% of unmet demand is due to regional water table elevation being below the bottom of the well, I think in one of the last presentations that you gave, Jeff, it looked as though like Casa Grande water table was, I'm just generalizing, that general region was a lot lower than, let's say, Eloy Coolidge area, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, so the two subbasins have deep and out towards the east and west portions of the AMA have deep aquifer thickness. In between, and along Casa Grande and the I-10 corridor is an area called the Casa Grande Ridge, where depth of bedrock is hundreds of feet versus several thousands out in the centers of the base of the subbasins. So there is just a physical limitation on aquifer thickness in an area where there's a lot of assured water supply determinations, and I think probably future demand for additional assured water supply and population growth.
So based on that, I'm like looking sort of more solution driven than anything else. There's going to come a point where the narrative becomes, I have a subdivision looking for a certificate of assured water supply in Coolidge. The water table is ample deep enough to support 100 years of pumping, but based on unmet demand in a Casa Grande area, if I'm reading it right, because we look at things regionally, you will not get a certificate of assured water supply subdivision in Coolidge, hypothetically.
That is correct.
Okay, that's good. So, how does the department go about, or do you think the department is open to solutions, saying that there's you have the ability to physically transfer water from one area to the other. Is that something that the department is open to as a solution where that happens, a market-based solution or an overall, public-private solution where they look at transferring of water?
Yeah, this is beyond my modeling.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to answer that.
But basically, right now, the answer that you're giving is, yes, hypothetically, at some point, you could be a subdivision in Coolidge with plenty of depth in your water table, and because the model shows a major unmet demand, 75% coming from low water tables, that would be an area in the I-10 corridor, you're not going to get approved for a certificate.
We are not issuing certificates now or analyses because of the unmet demand, period. I'm ready to move on to the second part of that, which is to deal with the depth of the water table. Second part of question 4, where it says what portion is related to depth exceeding 1,100 feet. Wasn't a little confused on that exactly, but the way I'm reading that and the way we answered it is, where do we have, if any, locations where the static depth of water is below 1,100 feet, which is another requirement that has to be met to issue an assured water supply determination. That's correct. Yeah. So in our model report, for those who remember, there's really only one area that exceeds the 1,100 foot depth limit after 100 years of pumping, and that's in the Eloy area. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have depth of water problems where we don't have 1,100 feet of aquifer. So where there is 1,100 feet of aquifer, the only place where there's exceedances after 100 years of pumping is in the Eloy area. So in looking at that, there are a number of, I don't remember, I want to say it's 20 to 30 wells in that ballpark of proposed wells that we've put in over assured water supply overlays that have been issued that are in that area that therefore would be in exceedance of that 1,100 foot area. I also believe that one of the City of Eloy provider wells is in that area too, so that could be a problem for them. So there are some proposed wells and potentially a well or two where there is depth to water exceedances of 1,100 feet, but it's rather isolated. I was reminded this morning on the way over here, there's also an area just to the west of that along, I forgot what the mountains just to the west of town of Eloy are. Where there's shallow aquifer, there's also some depth to, I think there's a well or two that has exceedance issues as well. So it's not as prevalent an issue, but it does exist in the modeled area. Any questions on that? Question 5, what portion of assured water supply, and I'm reading this as overall assured water supply, not just analyses.
The question was actually focusing on the analyses only because I believe the assumption was that if there is, I'm sorry, I'll talk loud enough. There's probably some joke I can make out of that, but I probably won't. Where was I going with the question? So analyses that overlay an IGFR, I guess you told earlier that the ag pumping is taken out and the analysis, the assured water supply demands for the analysis are put in, correct? So,
same for certificates.
Same for certificates, I understand that. Generally though, certificates that overlay an IGFR, there's probably been an extinguishment of the right for the IGFR, although there could be cases where I guess there's still a certificate there, but I just don't know. But the reason I was asking that question here was mainly driven by where the analyses are replacing an ag demand with their own demand. And that's why I was asking the question the way I asked it there. Probably inartfully, but that's why I was asking the question.
Well, and so my response is 57% of certificates and analyses of issued analyses and certificates are overlaying district boundaries. What I will say, so we don't have the specific answer for just the analyses portion, but my belief would be that out of that 57%, a large portion of that's going to be associated with analyses, more so than certificates.
That probably sets up having, for the group to understand where locationally those are located, where the analyses overlay in IGFR, where it results in an unmet demand. We just want to understand,
Well, there's a really, the report has a figure of that specifically. I mean, I can.
8.5 by 11 is a little hard even for me with a magnifying glass, but
Well, you can blow it up, and if I would put it online, but yeah, we have that so you can see where the analyses overlay, and then we even show which wells then, the ag wells that are taking out of production, you can see where those are too. So do you want us to get a number for you on the analyses? Just the analyses themselves that overlay?
it might be helpful to know those analyses demands that overlay in IGFR. Perhaps what the the total demand was for all those analyses that overlay in IGFR.
Okay. Okay. Oh, you do have the numbers? Okay.
So I have that 75% of the analyses footprint are on IGFRs. Some are also within districts, and some are on those other kind of IGFRs that aren't on districts. So, yeah.
So what is that? 75?
The thing is not so much are they within a district or are they not within a district. That's probably a piece of information that we probably need to know. It's mainly where it overlays in IGFR. So if there's an independent pumper out there that's serving themselves, we understand that the analysis demand replaces the ag demand. But knowing where they're at and how many of those analyses overlay in IGFR versus an analysis on desert land, for example, would be good information for us to know. So it sounds like 75% are.
Yeah, most of them.
IGFR.
Yeah.
That's probably close enough ballpark purposes.
But we're not doing a one-for-one replacement. We're not. It doesn't. Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Question 6. Why didn't ADWR consider urbanization of Hohokam and San Carlos lands over the 100-year modeling period, except for where the analyses and certificates of assured water supply overlay those lands? The short answer is we didn't have information from those districts. We are open for consistency purposes of looking at that urbanization as well. So I think we're going to be getting information from the agricultural community, and we can have those discussions. And if there's interest in doing that, we understand that that's not consistent, but because we didn't have the information from the districts like we did the other two, we did not include that.
Is there specific TAS information relating to those areas as opposed to?
Repeat that.
Is there specific TAS information or population projection information for Hohokam and San Carlos Irrigation District?
It's for the whole country,
Okay.
for the whole state, I should say.
So it is doable to take a look at that to see whether urbanization within those areas, to what?
I'm going to go out on a limb for my AMA staff and say yes.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
Second part of question 6 said if ADWR had considered urbanization of these district lands, how much of these demands would have decreased over time? Short answer is no way to know until we run it. Obviously, there would be some decrease since some of the ag lands would be going out, and we aren't replacing it with municipal or assured water supply demands on top of, in place of the urbanized ag lands. Moving on, question 7. Oh, sure.
When you're thinking through urbanization, are you taking into account the renewable energies things that are going on in Pinal County with the considerable amount of acreage that's being committed to solar? Because of course their water demands are going to be hugely less than residential or any commercial or industrial. And from what we are looking at in Pinal County, I mean, whether it's any one of these water districts or in the AMA itself, I mean, we, without going to brokers, know about 40 to 50,000 acres of lands that are probably tied up for anything from 3 to 6 years in options for solar companies. And I know of at least 10,000 acres within Eloy, Coolidge and Casa Grande that are actively going to be put into solar that probably have analyses on them. So that might be something to consider, because that's a huge difference from yesteryear, because they were not around 3 years ago and they're now here with force. Just a thought for you.
Well, yeah, and again, as modelers, we are not going through and trying to figure out development trends or plans or what all types of activities could be replacing agriculture. We're looking at very big picture. That's why we're open to taking information from districts and others who know of these things. Like I said, that's not part of our day-to-day activity to track what all the development plans for solar. But if there are, we need the information, what the projections are going to be. If there is some valid information that would support some lands going out of production due to solar, that's well within bringing to our attention.
There was an outside party that I think solidified the fact that your model works. Just some of the assumptions are in question, which is what we're talking about. But that outside company, we were quite surprised to not get any contact from them, being an analysis holder, and I guess the certificate holders and the doors holders. I think that might be one good approach, because if you're doing your modeling, then going back to who already have certificates or analyses and get an update, because I mean, Pinal County was almost dormant from 2008 to 2018, and now things have progressed considerably with all the job creation that's gone on and the home building that's back. So just a food for thought.
Well, and I'll just tell you that a lot of these analyses and certificates, the development companies, they change, they get sold. Going back and trying to track down owners and developers is not really, would be a very good use of our time. But that's why we will take, if I think now and I'm going to speak generally, just a lot of people don't want to share information that they aren't obligated to share. And that, I think that was especially true when there are no issues. Now maybe because we've identified some issues going forward, people will want to be more informative to us and help us put together a better model. And if they want to bring that information to us, we'd love to have it. Question 7 has to do with Gila River flows concerning San Carlos Irrigation District water from the Gila River system. Why did ADWR use only the more recent 15-year period of time for supply estimates rather than the long period of historical Gila flows? The primary reason for that is we tried to pick a period that was, how did I write that, with less spikes of extreme conditions. Tried to pick a period that had more normalized flow, looking out over 100 years. Nobody can predict what those flows are going to be, so we tried to keep it in a more average range. We also picked a recent period because our belief is the most recent past is probably more indicative of going forward over the next 100 years. But it's not a, it's not a magic bullet. There's there's a longer period of record that we could use. I don't know if, I think there's a question here about 100 years. Using a true 100-year record, I don't know if we'd have that on at least 2 gauges. But we tried to, yeah. Hold on, Keith, wait for the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, impounds along the river have really, to a large extent, controlled the flow and the magnitude of the flow and frequency of events. And so really there is no downstream gauge from the impounds that has a 100-year record. So again, what Jeff said, we pretty much just picked out the most plausible recent term information with the greatest, the most available data available. So, I mean, I'm personally a fan of stochastic modeling, but as Jeff said, this is a deterministic solution and program. So we basically used what we had available. So.
The San Carlos Irrigation District has delivered impounded water from the bottom of the reservoir since 1924. And those records are absolutely 100% available in detail, both surface water flows and pumping records. They're 100% available. And that's not 100 years, but it's 96. The concept of this 15-year period that's been put here, that I assume is, what, 2000 to 2015?
It's 95 to 2010.
Okay. 96 to 2010. Well, in the last 10 years, there's only been 1 year where the combined allotment exceeded a foot. And if you go back through the history of the project, other than the 1980s, which was truly a decadal anomaly, but still, if you add it into the decades and decades and decades of virtually no delivery, I just don't understand how in the world, with what I know the reality to be anywhere close to 2.16 acre feet of delivery, using historical records that are totally available.
As I told you, we picked a specific year, not 100 years worth of data. So that's where the 2.16 came from.
Hopefully a further discussion.
Flip the mic upside down again. Thank you, Jeff. So I'm actually probably going to speak to the second half of the question too, which I know you haven't answered yet, but I don't believe you have anyway. But so I think it's important for us to know, probably from 2 perspectives. On the supply side, you know, what can we expect as far as flows from the Gila River towards meeting skid land or obligations to deliveries, correct? That's number 1. So that's on the supply side. And number 2, it's also on how much they're actually going to be delivering, because I understand the skid wells are controlled by skid and delivered to the users, or the actual landowners themselves use those wells? Well, let me take it back. They're not controlled by the farmer. They're not owned by the farmers. They're used for the purpose of delivering within the district, right? Understand. So, and the reason I was asking about the 15-year period was because, and it was, you basically overlaid that 15-year cyclical nature throughout the modeling period of the model, right? And so the reason I was asking about, what it was, and I probably inartfully asked the question, it wasn't so much how did it vary. Obviously, you probably answered more why it varied, because of the variability of rain and so forth, right? As opposed to how much did it vary in quantity. So if you were to go back, say, and look at the last 30 years versus, say, the 96 to 2010 period, how much water does that represent? Whether a more recent period is more representative of a going forward period, it was the time period you chose, and I understand that. But I think as a group we need to understand, what does that mean to skid lands anyway, as far as a supply, and to some degree the demands the deliveries that will be made for pumping plus, on-river type water. I mean, Scott, you're a skid area guy, so you know that probably better than most in the room. So I think that's a question for the group to grapple with, so. I apologize for my inartful question of the how. I think how does the sun rise? Well, I suppose because of the Earth rotation, but not exactly what I was asking, but
Okay, so,
how much does it vary?
oh,
If you're looking at the 15-year period you chose versus another period, last 25 years or the last 50 years, some sense of, on average, what would it have looked like? Is it, 70,000 acre feet per year versus 30,000 acre feet per year of supply off the river? And then how it might
okay,
affect
well,
demands? That was the question.
we can definitely pull that information. I don't have it right here
No,
today.
that's
Yeah.
That's probably one of those clarifying questions.
Okay.
we should have asked.
I thought it was more related to why did we use the 15-year period? So then the next question about how it differs from the past 130 years. So those are what you want to see is the variation over the different time periods.
Yeah, I think we probably should at least take a look at that. So.
Okay. Make a note of that, Diane. Thanks.
But they're very visible.
I think that takes care of question 7 then. Anybody else? So next has to do with some discretionary questions for the department, and I'm going to turn that one over to Nicole.
So the question is regarding designation demands. What discretion does ADWR have in modeling designation demands? Is this by statute or rule? And why not ramp up demands in a similar manner to population or urbanization projections or estimates? And our physical availability rule is AAC R12-15-716. And specifically in 716B3C Romanet 2, it covers designation demands and requires that designation demands be modeled at the full build-out volume for the 100-year period. So that's what was included in this model. Should I keep going through the next few? Or?
Well, the next one, I think I have a clarifying question, if I may. So we're in close proximity, so it makes it easy. So does that rule you cited here, Nicole, preclude the department from doing a ramp-up of demands such that the full demand is modeled but in a ramped-up fashion? Or does it specifically require that it be modeled at 100% of the total demand in year one?
I don't have the rule in front of me, but I do believe that the rule says that it has to include 100 years of the full demand of the designation.
So if you ramped up, once you got to 100%, then you'd have to model that 100 years, because you have to model the full demand for 100 years according to the rule, right? And that doesn't work because it's only 100 years.
Probably a minor thing, but I think as a group, we just wanted to understand how that demand was being modeled and what the rules require. So to the extent that the group has an interest in looking at what the rules provide, obviously if the demands were ramped up over some kind of projection or build out of that provider's demand, it would probably shave off some of the demand over the 100-year period. So I think as a group, we just have to look at that and see what it might mean.
We may also, if that happens to occur over ag lands, whether the ag would remain while we ramp up the assured water supply demands.
We're right at 11:30, so we have about 30 minutes left, just for everybody to understand where they are on the clock. So I don't see us getting through all the questions today, but anyway.
I thought we're doing pretty good.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
Earlier, one of the questions had to do with how if there was an assured water supply determination over agricultural lands, the ag land was shut off and the certificate of the analyses was turned on at full force starting on that day. But I thought I heard it said that that was not true of the designations of assured water supply. So is it possible that the ag lands underneath the designations, is there pumping continuing there as well as we've ramped up the designations at the same time? Is that a possibility?
Designations are ramped up day one, full demand. If there are underlying ag production on those inside the designated provider service area, those are continued too. We have no way of knowing where the urbanization will come within the designated provider. So maybe we can look at something where we have to address that, but the way it's in the model right now is full designated volume. If there are ag lands within that designated provider service area, those are pumping too.
I think that's a good point. You know, we at Global Water are developing on ag lands and have a designation and maybe finding a way to either turn off or turn off over time some of those ag lands like the analyses. But
Well, not necessarily, because we don't know where the development is going to occur. It could fully build out and the ag land stay.
Can I add something onto the order? Salad. Shrimp fed a salad with extra shrimp.
Hey, whoever just ordered the shrimp, you're not on mute with us.
You're not on mute. All right. Thank you.
Now I'm hungry.
Especially if you're not delivering lunch.
Yes, to the group. So I think I got all that out, but yeah, I guess it's technically possible, but we don't know where the development's occurring, so we can't know for sure. Go ahead, Diane.
Okay, so the designations are very large and they overlap very much with the two largest districts. And so the ramp down on the ag is spread out among whatever's left of the ag. And ADWR did not speculate as to where the urbanization would happen within designations and where the ag would be turned on or off. But we do show the ag demands going down gradually over time just in those two districts to account for that. So that's kind of how it was handled in a sort of spread out way.
Thanks, Diane.
So I think that is to say that there's not necessarily double counting in the model, but it may not accurately represent specifically where the pumping would take place or where it would shift around for designations. Is that what you would say?
Right,
If I may, so I'm not going to call it double pumping, but within a designated provider's area, whatever demands are in their designation that have been already determined and approved by the director, to the extent that there are any ag lands within those areas that is served by that designated provider within its designation quantities, that ag demand would go away, just like effectively you've done so by replacing an analysis demand or an ag demand with an analysis demand where an analysis overlays an IGFR. On a you know, I know you don't know where it's going to urbanize within the provider's area, but certainly if they serve any of those lands, that land will in fact not be pumping anymore. It will be replaced by the designation demand. So there's some overlap there. I think it's just an area for understanding how the assumptions are used and made. It just gives us something to look at, whether it's something we can pursue, whether it would free up additional supplies or not.
Moving on, question 9, concerning certificated demands, how have actual or new water use model demands compared to committed demands for subdivisions covered by a certificate? 15% less, 20% less, more. So we did an analysis through 2016 for fully built-out certificates only, and found that there was roughly a 30% actual use difference than the issued demands. So, and of course, the issued demands were based using the demand calculator for whenever the application was submitted. We have I believe it came out in 2015 or 2016, a new demand calculator that overall has less water use in it. So going forward, anything that would be submitted would use that reduced demand calculator. But we're talking about a very small amount of water. We're talking about issue demands of about 3,000 acre feet versus roughly 2,000 or so in actual use. So it's a small sample size, but there is an observed actual use less than issued demands. Any questions on that? Nicole, you're back up. Second half of question 9.
So the next question is paralleling question 8, but with respect to certificates, what discretion does DWR have in modeling demands where we have evidence that actual or estimated demands are less than committed demands? And that's for certificates. And again, we go to 716B3, and here it's subsections B and C that essentially they generally require that the department consider the issued demand of the certificate for the full 100-year period, but then they allow for projections for us to adjust projections if we have evidence that those demands will be lower or reduced relative to current pumping. And so in the 2019 model run, we adjusted that for fully constructed certificates because we know we have enough information based on those issued certificates to suggest that for X number of lots, there would be, Y amount of demand per lot times X. In the not fully built out certificates, they could still be subject to plat changes and be assigned. The same thing goes for the analyses. The development plans can change and that can shift around the demand information. So for those, we still use the full issued demand.
Keep it, because which is well, I can say question 10 is C question 9, so. Yeah, so it's.
Yeah, so that's a question about whether the model could show a ramp up of demands based on population projections rather than starting with the full issued demand in year 1. And just like we said for designations, and then using the rule citations in 9, in the response to 9 that address certificated demands, we're required by the rule to use 100% of the demand starting in year 1.
11 is you.
Okay, so 11 is a change in subject regarding CAGRD replenishment, and for projects that are not included in the CAGRD's 2015 Plan of Operation, how does ADWR intend to include such replenishment where a subdivision has become a member land after the 2015 Plan of Operation, and whether that would be incrementally? And just to go back and clarify the starting point for this question, the replenishment assumptions in the model for CAGRD replenishment are based on the projections in the 2015 Plan of Operation submitted to the department by the CAGRD. And that was 15,500 acre feet per year of replenishment over the 100-year projection period. And I think for comparison, the actual projection, the most recent information that we had was showing that in 2018, it was about 550 acre feet during the year 2018 that were actually replenished. So that 15,500 is actually a projection number, and specifically that includes the projected replenishment obligation, not just for everything that's already enrolled, whether it's built out or not, but also for those lands that are projected to be enrolled over the subsequent 10 years. So that number that the CAGRD provided to us and that we used already includes some projected additions to CAGRD enrollment. Let's see, and then the next, should I go into
Yeah.
the next part?
Yep.
So does ADWR recognize that the groundwater allowance for subdivisions platted or where a certificate is approved after the 2019 Assured Water Supply rule change for Pinal AMA requires 100% replenishment for non-IGFR land and approximately 85% for IGFR lands that extinguish the IGFR rights? Our response is that obviously we recognize our rules and that our rules have changed recently, but we have not issued any certificates in the Pinal AMA since that rule change in 2019, and we would address the volume of extinguishment credits and future certificates at that time.
Okay, normally we shy away from asking an attorney questions at these meetings, but you will not fare so well today. So I actually think the response sort of skirted around the issue, because the intent of the changes to both the 2007 and the 2019 changes to assured water supply rules in Pinal was specifically to reduce the amount of allowable groundwater that could be pumped for a new subdivision, that it would in fact be required to provide and to obligate themselves to more GRD replenishment. The extinguishing credits prior to that were ongoing. They did not expire. They had 1.5 acre feet per year for all of time, whatever that means. 2007, it ramped it down to where they were going to be phased out over a certain number of years. The stakeholder group down here in Pinal wanted to approach that issue from a different perspective. And so what they adopted with Supervisor Miller's guidance, I think, in that process was something that was fair to all IGFR right holders. They would get a sort of a fair, similar treatment for extinguishing their rights to farm that land. But the fact is that there is a practical amount of water that they can pump without replenishment, because it's now going to require effectively GRD member land membership for those lands almost entirely. And I know there's extinguishing credits that exist out there, but the bottom line is we're looking here as, I'm not going to point fingers, or I'm not going to criticize, but surely the changes to these assured water rules was meant to reduce allowable groundwater and require more replenishment. And I think the group needs to understand, how is the department going to factor that in going forward? I suppose as each land enrolls in the GRD and it becomes part of the plan of operation, I suppose in 2025, when the next plan of operation is adopted, there will be additional projections of lands going forward, right? But I'm assuming those lands will have to show whether they're going to have allowable groundwater or not. The GRD plan of operation can't ignore what their obligations will be for those new member lands. They'll have to estimate. And so all we're looking for here is a similar recognition by the department that those lands that do become member lands, or subdivisions that become member lands in the future, will largely have to replenish that water. And I guess what we're seeing is that the plan of operation really is the basis for the department to include that replenishment in the model, right? In this case, 15,500. I appreciate the explanation that that includes a projection of member enrollment through 2024. And so to the extent that those projections are included, there is a certain amount of water factored into the model for lands that will become, subdivision will become member lands, at least in the next 4 years, right?
As they projected back in 2015, yes.
Anyway, that was probably a criticism, Nicole. I don't know if there's a question in there, but we'll see when we see, I guess.
This comment is kind of out of, this working? This is out of sequence, but you mentioned earlier that you had interaction with MSIDD staff on some of these projections. MSIDD would like to be, I think, more active. We would like to, we have not approved any of the numbers at the board level, and our operating assumptions, our investment assumptions, all of these are very complicated, as you might imagine, and the board should opine on these, and we would like to get back to you on a new approved projection because we think it's an important issue, and not all of that has gone in. We don't know exactly how technical staff interfaced, but there's a lot more to be said.
And we welcome that. As I've said before, and Scott's probably heard it a few times now, we're not farmers, so we don't operate your land, so we recognize you'll have better insight on a lot of areas. But everybody has to remember, this is a 100-year projection, and it's over a large area. So we aren't looking for what's happening at each IGFR. We're looking regionally and long-term planning. Thanks. Anything else? Does it? Okay. Question 13, lucky 13. Has ADWR run the Pinal model within the last 24 months to see how any of the changes in the programmatic assumptions that were subject of stakeholder discussions in the past 3 years have reduced unmet demands? What were the results of those model runs concerning unmet demands? So I'll first address that we run the model in the last 24 months, and we did a run that had some aggressive programmatic assumptions that were subject to stakeholder discussions, and that ultimately were not included in this run. We did not believe that these assumptions were realistic or permissible under state statute and rule. I've bulleted 4 of those programmatic assumptions that we thought were of most interest. One was just applying a reduced demand calculator to all the issued but unbuilt demands, analysis, certificates, and designations, because that would, in theory, lower the overall assured water supply demands. Secondly, to sum this up, is assuming that every issued certificate, analysis, and designation, or not the designations, the certificates and analyses, would have some component of effluent that would ultimately be, facilities would be constructed, and there would be reuse and recharge, and we would just assume that those would be built, and we should just incorporate those into the model from the beginning, which would offset the demands significantly. Thirdly, assuming full CAGRD replenishment of all issued analyses and certificates, all determinations. Again, and we were talking for analyses by themselves, we're talking over in the range of 115,000, 116,000 acre feet per year of demand associated with those analyses, and assuming that you're going to replenish 100% of that would produce over 100,000 acre-feet of replenishment. That was not, we did do a run with that, but we did not include that in this final run. And then lastly, there was, we looked at and we did some significant lateral movement of well pumping, assuming that you could just pump from basically anywhere where there was additional aquifer thickness, and that somehow the water would get to where it was needed. So those were 4 large assumptions that we did look at, but ultimately have chosen not to include in our model run. Secondly, we've mentioned, Bill outlined it perfectly. We did a run in 2017 where we had significantly more agricultural demands. We reduced those agricultural demands in the final run for 2019, which reduced the unmet demand. So in a nutshell, that's our response for that question. Any questions from?
I got one for you, and then I'll bring it over to you, Bill. You know, it sounds almost like you kind of did a planning run, and you looked back at those assumptions, and you said they're not maybe realistic to assume legally in the assured water supply model. But based on that, are there any results that you could share with us that could help lead us to water solutions? Like, was the effluent piece really significant, or?
Probably need to discuss that with the director. Some of those, hold on.
Thanks, man.
Just thought I wouldn't need a microphone.
It's just for the recording.
Sure. Yeah, we would need to inquire with Director Bushotsky regarding that. Some of these inputs were sent over to hydrology without the director's awareness to begin with, and so, I mean, he really didn't perceive it as desirable to run those through the model when they weren't legitimate in the first place. So whether we further discuss some of these matters, I mean, basically we just need to talk with Tom and to see if he wants to have us relate this in a context of a future meeting.
Thank you. And we'd probably like to figure out how we can make some things like that legitimate through this process. So any insights that you guys can share would be really helpful.
Thank you, Jake. I think this question actually probably, I think Jake already shaped it. As a group, we probably would have, you know, of all the things we've been talking about over the last 3 or 4 years, how many of them would have had a positive effect towards mitigating the unmet demand that we're trying to resolve here, right? So, so I think this is probably one of the more important questions we have here. Some of the developers have asked, probably primarily the analysis holders, if they took a haircut, I'll call it a haircut. If they came in with a lower demand as when they applied for a certificate, by and large, would that help to reduce the unmet demand? That's one question. 2, concerning you know, reclaim water within these areas. I mean, we realize that there are legal barriers to including these in assured water supply because of that lack of either a connection or a contract requirement.
Yeah, there's nothing tangible with them yet.
Fully understand that, but I think as a group, I think we want to explore if those are areas that do help bridge that unmet demand. In other words, if we can bring more reclaimed water to offset demands, or at least bring additional supply in, if we can restate demands to a lesser number, if we can bring the GRD in, and we understand maybe the limitations may be more tied to the plan of operation as opposed to each individual project that might become a member land, we get that. And then lateral movement of well pumping, there's probably legal limitations on moving wells around and still having them be considered a service area well, right? Along with all of the other limitations of drilling a new well. But as a group, though, we wanted to explore these areas because these are areas we thought we could take action on as a group and come up with a way to make them legally enforceable or legally permissible within the limitations here, and so forth. So I think that's why we asked the question, but we understand the explanation of why you did not bring them into the October 19 model run because of the factors you stated here. So we recognize that.
Yeah. And as I stated in question 1, we dealt with the effluent side, and we said, if you bring something to us, we'll evaluate it and tell you where it works and where it doesn't. So, if there's no, so.
I think DWRs can answer 2 more, so maybe run over just a few minutes.
Yeah,
That's okay.
and they're a really quick one because they're about industrial uses. The first was in concerning industrial water use assumptions in the model, what portion of industrial use is associated with type 1s, GIUs, type 2s. The short answer is we did not break down the industrial use by the type of permit. It was just we used the 2015 total industrial pumping, and that was carried through and held constant for the 100 years. So it did not matter what the type of permit was. Now, the second question kind of deals with general industrial use permits, because I think there's maybe some issue about the timing of those and how long they're good for. So let me jump to those, and then if we have a question, it says, what is the typical or average term of a GIU permit? And the answer is there is no typical term. They're evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but there is a maximum length of time for those permits, which is 50 years, and they're subject to renewal under the same criteria as the original issuance. We did a little analysis and found that for active general industrial use permits in the Pinal AMA, they range from terms of 2 years to 49 years. And I'll say there's, I think, only 15 or so active permits, so there aren't that many active GIU permits. So in a nutshell, that's the answer to those 2 questions regarding general industrial, or regarding industrial uses in the model. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Jeff. Concerning industrial use, and I think the reason why this question is important to the group, if you look at the municipal use, I'm not talking about assured water supply unmet demand, but if you look at municipal use and you look at industrial use, collectively, I believe they equate to about 800,000 acre-feet of unmet demand over the 100-year period. Industrial was probably over 85%, or actually it was even more than that, 90% of that 800,000 was relating to, and you have the number right up here, 728,000 acre-feet. You look at the municipal, it's only 53,000, or 0.66% of the overall unmet demand. That's why we needed to understand better about industrial. So if it was a type 1 right, it's an ongoing right, it's pertinent to the land, and there's no subject of canceling that type 1 right. They can continue to pump that just like an IGFR would continue to pump, correct? And a type 2 right is also a permanent right, although that right can be moved.
But still within the AMA.
It was still within the AMA, but and I understand you modeled it based on what it was pumping at the time, and you just continued that forward consistently. But I think as a group, we just needed to understand, where within what we're looking at, there's an ability to maybe find some solution for that, because it is the overall between the municipal and industrial. I mean, of those 2, industrial makes up the largest, percentage of the unmet demand within those 2 categories. That's why it's important for us to focus on it. It's more of a statement, but
Yeah.
and if it's a GAU permit and it can't be renewed because, is the criteria that there's no water there?
Yeah, good question. So as you see in your sheet, the questions, I think it starts with 16, 17, and the policy questions, we did not provide written responses at this time. So we felt that was really beyond the scope of what we were here today to talk about. So not saying we're not willing to talk about them, we are, but we we're focusing more on the modeling side of things. And although we did expand into pulled the legal and the big deputy director in, we'll save these other questions for another day.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Deputy Director Chandler, for allowing the staff to come down here. Jeff, thank you. We're here to get information. We're here to understand how the department came on these assumptions. So we will have another one of these type of meetings for the technical staff. I'm guessing in around 3 weeks, we'll start looking at a calendar and work with the department. I really appreciate, though, the department's willingness to provide this information to all of us. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you later.